Welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. I'm Kim Ayres. I'm a creative, professional portrait and narrative photographer. The aim of these sessions is to help you improve your understanding of photography. And every Tuesday at 7:30 UK time, I will answer questions, give feedback on submitted images, and give you some of the insights into the creative processes and decisions on my own photos. If you find these sessions useful, please consider leaving a donation at paypal.me/Kim Ayres. But before we get into critiquing submitted photos and answering questions, tonight I'm going to be looking specifically at the rule of thirds. But I'm going to begin with a photo I created for Dumfries and Galloway Life magazine of the tailor Andrew Livingston. Actually, before that, I want to thank David, Zoe, Kaylee, my wife Maggie, and especially my son Rogan for all their feedback on last week's episode, first episode I'd ever done. It was incredibly useful. I've tried to implement some of the changes that were suggested, including I've changed the lighting system setup and also kind of this little box around me to be able to sort of say what the podcast is about and allow people to follow me on the various social media outlets if they're wanting. So, okay, so now back to Andrew Livingston. So basically, Andrew is a fourth generation tailor based in Castle Douglas, G. Livingston and Son. 1896, I think they were set up, and Dumfries and Galloway Life magazine were doing this big article on him, and I was commissioned to do a photo. Right, even more. Right, now I have transferred it. Okay, so here we are then. We have this picture of Andrew Livingston. Now, the initial idea, brief, was to try and get something which looked a bit like the Kingsman poster, where you have the film Kingsman. You've got Colin Firth dressed in a very dapper suit standing outside his London tailors. Now, Andrew is quite an amazing tailor. He's Savile Row trained, creates amazing suits and highly skilled. So we wanted to get a shot of him outside the window of his shop. Now, this looks like a relatively deceptively easy photo. Bloke stands outside shop, window behind him. But it's actually a lot more complicated than it looks, and that's why I really wanted to talk about this one tonight. Because what I really want to point out is that while you can see Andrew here standing, looking, perfectly happy and good, it's actually a 3-layer photo. Because immediately, whilst they've got the window behind him, you can then see the suits you can see the shop basically through the window. But then there's a third layer, which is you can see the reflection of the buildings of Castle Douglas, which is the Scottish town in which both I and Andrew live. Now, to actually get those 3 layers were not particularly easy. In essence, earlier in the day, I'd been walking up the road, and the road runs from northeast to southwest, the main high street in Castle Douglas. Now, what that means is up until about 3 o'clock, the sun hits the buildings opposite this, and there was massive reflections in the window. So you wouldn't have seen inside the shop. All you would have seen would have been the glaring buildings on the other side of the road. As the sun sort of swings round, there's a 15-minute window where it lines up perfectly along the street, where it's no longer reflecting on the buildings behind. But then by about 3:15, the sun then hits the windows on his side of the street, and suddenly you've got all the glare again. So we just had this very small opportunity to try and make sure we could actually get the photo that we wanted. So what I've done here is, as the sun has been coming up the street, he's lit on one side of it, and then I've used an off-camera flash on the other side just to fill in the shadows so they wasn't completely lost in the shadows. The advantage then of getting this narrow window of opportunity was that it allowed, as I said, for you can then see these suits on the tailor's dummies behind, and you can make out the town behind. And what's quite good about this is it's very obviously a Scottish town. Just the kind of rooftops and the buildings, it's not particularly English, you know, so it is a reflection of place, which was really important in the photo. Just for your own interest, this is actually the original photo. This is obviously the edited version. So if I've just flipped back to here, you can see that part of what I've done is obviously I've brought out the details in the shadows. What I've also done is I've taken out these lights that were running in, and also you can see here there's the flash, which is actually reflecting from when I was shooting from the side. So I had to kind of remove that, remove the lighting and lighten him up. And overall we ended up with that. So it went into the magazine, took up a nice kind of, not quite a full double page spread, but sort of top half of one page spilling over onto the other. Worked quite well. So that's just a little bit of background about creating that photo. Now, the other thing about this photo, for those who are just getting into that photography as well, is that I didn't do him smack bang in the middle. I didn't have him standing face onto the camera, the shop directly behind him, and him sitting in the middle of the picture. And this brings us on to the idea of what's commonly known as the rule of thirds. Now, those who haven't heard of it, you might be doing your photography, and this will, you know, come as, oh right, there's a whole new area I knew nothing about. Those who've been doing photography for any real length of time have sooner or later tended to hear of this. I tend to feel of it as a slightly unfortunate term because it's called rule of thirds as though it's a rule and you have to follow it. You certainly don't have to follow it. I would call it more of a guideline of thirds. So what's the notion about thirds? The notion of thirds is that instead of having that, photos very often work best rather than when the main subject is dead center but is off to one side. So if you were to divide this screen into three and then divide it into three another way, you would end up with a kind of noughts and crosses, or tic-tac-toe to my North American friends, grid. And this is such a popular understanding that you very often find in the backs of cameras. You can, in your viewfinder or your screen that you look at in the back, that you can flip on or off a little grid. And if I do this, I don't know, hopefully you can see that grid that's come on. What you notice here is that Andrew is just sort of running along this line here rather than being in dead center. I suppose if I was to just move him into the center, now it's not really working because we've got this big white patch on the side, but it does change the feel of it a bit. Just having him slightly off to one side just creates a little bit more energy, a little bit more tension. So probably the best way to demonstrate this now is by using a much simpler photo. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip over to an old photo I took years ago. It's a lighthouse, little lighthouse at the end of a breakwater in Berwick upon Tweed, over in northwest England. Now, the important part of this, well, what I've done with the edit of this is, just to sort of make it less complicated, is I've pretty much smoothed out the sea and I've removed a chunk of beach that was just sitting in the foreground. So what we've got here is we've got a square and we've got our little key object sitting smack bang in the middle of the photo. And, you know, it's fine. There's something reasonably pleasing about the photo. I think those kind of nice soft pastel colours. I mean, it was, you know, beautiful pinks in the skies and the soft creamy blue in the bottom. But the lines are such that the sea and the sky divide exactly in the middle, and the lighthouse itself sits exactly in the middle. And it's okay, but you lose interest in it very quickly. The brain, it sort of evolved to notice things that are different, and it, or more specifically, it's evolved to filter out things that aren't. It filters out stuff that you're used to. It filters out things that you've kind of got the hang of. You think you know what you're doing already. So it's no longer necessary to use part of your brain power for it. So your brain just goes, okay, I don't need to worry about that. And you kind of forget it, ignore it. So when you have a photo which is exactly symmetrical or very symmetrical, it doesn't really hold the attention very much, because very quickly it's done everything it needs to do. Your brain can see, okay, big blank chunk of sea underneath, everything's even. There's not a lot to it, really. So if we want to create a bit more interest, maybe we can start playing with this rule of thirds. So what I want to do now, so if I go back to creating this grid, we can see that this is sitting here in the middle. But if I just drag this edge over to here, now it's off center. And somehow it slightly more grabs the attention. It emphasizes the breakwater coming out into the middle of the water, into the middle of the sea. Okay, let's undo that. Let's try it again, but actually pull in from the other side. Now, again, it's sitting off center, but there's much more emphasis on the sea. It feels like it's sort of just peeking out into a bigger ocean. So that's a kind of side to side, like we did with that picture of Andrew. We've cropped it a third away along, but you can also do thirds in terms of height. So if we take this down to here, now what happens is, again, we've got a much bigger emphasis on the sea, and then the lighthouse and breakwater are just kind of poking above it. It's got a different feel. So you can see the sky is taking the top third, the sea is now taking the bottom 2/3. And again, if we take this crop and we move this up to there, now the emphasis is much more about the sky. Your eye is drawn much more to the pink clouds behind it. So you can start to see then how where you're cropping it is already starting to change the story. We talked last week very much about how the crop can affect the story. Changes the mood to it. But we can go further with this. We can do, let's say, I want to come down a third here and come in a third here. So now we're really getting the sense of sea stretching out down the bottom of the picture. Likewise, we could bring this up and we could bring this in. Now again, much more about the sky. So you can start to see, I mean, already we've done about half a dozen or so different kinds of crops, and they all look slightly more interesting than this one. We can take it a bit further, whereby, let's say I really bring it up because I want to emphasize the narrowness of it, and then bring that down to something like that. Now, at that point, we probably zoom in. We've kind of got something that's a bit more like a banner in a way. So you've got this nice long stretch going on. Sense of those nice coloured patches in the sky has gone. So what we could do is do that another way. If we bring this up and bring this across. So essentially I just keep moving until it's hitting one of these little junctions here. And now everybody's got a slightly different preference, but for my money, this is probably my favourite crop of the lot. You've got a sense of the breakwater just streaming out into the sea. You've got the beautiful clouds behind. And so this is your rule of thirds. This is where this lighthouse is now sitting right on this junction of a third of the way across and a third of the way up. So in essence, that's what rule of thirds is about. You will hear it mentioned many times, but you have that noughts and crosses grid, that tic-tac-toe grid, and there are particular points, and if this sort of inside square, the corners of this inside square, so here, 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 and here, these become the kind of crucial points because they're a third of the way in and a third of the way up or down. And so if you place your key element in one of those spots, very often you find the whole photo just works that little bit better. Because it's not exactly even, because it's not exactly symmetrical, the brain starts going, oh, something's not quite right. It engages that little bit more, and the longer the brain is engaging with it, essentially the more successful the image is. So really, that's what I wanted to say about rule of thirds. It crops up all over the place. Now, in successive weeks as we go on, I will talk about entirely different ways of looking at photography, different compositional techniques when rule of thirds just isn't going to work. And so, yeah, hopefully keep tuning in. Subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube to make sure you can see future episodes. And come and follow me on Facebook if you're watching it live here. So, okay, that's kind of that's where I wanted to start to go with that. So, next thing I want to do is hold on one sec. Let me just transition back and excuse me. It's another piece of feedback I got from last week to stop turning around to pick up my water over there. So now keeping it this side of the computer and desperately hoping I don't accidentally knock it over and spill the water all over my computer. Right, okay. So now what I want to do is move on to the critique and questions section. Now, the first image I'm going to pull up was, right, bear with me just one moment, submitted images. Paul Creswell, back here. So this was the photo that Paul submitted. And he said, please see an image I took in Strasbourg of a girl reading in a window. I've shown the original and my edited version for my camera club. I was pleased with the final edit, but it did not do well at the club. Any suggestions how I could have edited this image differently would be very welcome. Now, first of all, there is a notion of taste. There is always a notion of taste. You can submit what you consider to be your favoritist photo ever to any competition, whether it's a camera club, whether it's an online competition, whether it's some great big mega national or international competition, and you are convinced it's the greatest photo you've ever taken, if not the greatest photo anyone has ever taken, depending on how your ego is, only for it to not get anywhere, not get any kind of traction. Now, sometimes it's because you are emotionally invested in the photo in a way that other people aren't. And sometimes it's a matter of taste. I've judged a few competitions for a few camera clubs in Dumfries and Galloway. And I think one of the key tricks for ever getting any kind of success in competitions is, first of all, know your judge. I mean, generally speaking, because I'm a portrait photographer, I get more drawn to interesting portraits. So if I'm judging and a portrait grabs my attention, it's going to grab my attention more than, say, a landscape or wildlife photo is going to do. It might be a fantastically brilliant wildlife or landscape photo. It's just it doesn't grab my personal attention quite so much. So there's always that, and unless you know the judges particularly well, you're kind of up against it. So that's one aspect of it. However, if we're trying to improve our photography, we should never just go, oh well, didn't get there, write it off. I think it's a great photo. These Philistines obviously have no taste whatsoever, and sort of sit there in your own little corner, sort of growling at the world if it dares to look in your direction. If we're trying to improve our photography, we should be looking at how we can do that. Now, so Paul has done this. He's sent this in to say, well, he's done this photo, he's pleased with it, he's put it out there, hasn't got the kind of response he wanted to have. Now, I'm not the judges of the camera club, so I can't give any insights there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through how I see it. Now, the first thing that strikes me about this is I recognise this kind of photo, which is where you've got repetition, 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 something different. Okay? And in this case, we've got 4 windows, and then in the lower corner, we have the woman sitting at the window there. And so I've seen other similar kind of photos. That's not to say I've seen this exact photo, but it's not that there is something very pleasing. Sometimes you might get a grid of, say, 9 windows, and one of them just happens to have a light on and some movement in it, and your eye is drawn to it. It's a particular, again, compositional trick to have a lot of things the same and one little bit different, because it then draws your attention, and your brain starts going, oh, where's the story with this? So this presumably is what Paul has been going for. Now, my first thought with this is it's kind of too tight. There's not enough real room to breathe around this. And it's emphasized by the fact that we have an edge of wall coming down here. Can you actually, just hoping with you, yes, you can see my mouse there. So we've got an edge of wall on the left, we've got an edge of the wall on the right, we've got an edge of wall underneath, but the top bit of the wall is in shadow. And whilst it is still wall, because it's in a different colour, it's a bar, and it's sort of pushed it down, so it feels squashed at the top. It doesn't have that evenness around to frame it in quite the way that you're expecting. It just doesn't quite sit right. Now, the level at which you wish to edit this is down to a personal taste and personal approach, really. There are some photographers who would say, I want to get the photo the best image that I can, regardless of its relationship to truth or what was actually there at the time. So they might crop the bottom part. I mean, if I, just for example, if I, where are we? Go back to here. If I copy that bit of wall and move it up to here. Okay, not quite. Let's just, sorry, let's go back. Try that again. Let's copy that bit of wall. Paste. Now, despite the fact that it looks like it's the same colour as up here, as you can see, once you get up here, it is darker. What I might then do is, so just peering round the camera here, just so I can actually see what's on my screen. If I just maybe lighten that up a little bit so it sort of fits in a little bit more. Now, very, very rough, but automatically that I think gives it just a little bit more space to breathe. But I might even go a bit further and give it more space. But I have mucked around with the photo. And within photography circles, and especially within camera club circles, or some camera club circles, can be a real debate, strongly with strongly felt sides, as to how much you are allowed to edit a photo or muck about with a photo. Are you enhancing the story, or are you just making up fantasy worlds and not really telling the truth anymore? Now, so that's one aspect, is how much you want to edit that. Now, what Paul also did was he sent me the original. So we can see the original photo here. And now what we can see is that it was taken from this central part in the middle. Now, you can see the shadow running along the top there, coming from the roof. Now, what's interesting about this is there's a whole number of different stories you could get from this. If you were to, for example, come down to here, maybe pull that in a little bit or something like that. Then what you have is you have a building where you've got the water at the bottom with that lovely little plant just sticking up, and then you've got three different layers with the woman at the top with her reading. But it's a different story. You could just as easily have moved the camera slightly to the left or the right, taken in a different building, taken in part of the street, emphasised more of the architectural qualities to it. But what Paul decided to do was emphasise this square part. Now, another thing he's done is he's changed the colours. As you can see, in the original here, it's pink, and what he's done is he's shifted it into this yellow-orange. Now, again, there's a personal taste to this. Why might he have done it? I can't talk to Paul directly. I suspect that what it does is it gives a warmer, more Mediterranean feel. When you're looking at these kind of cool pinks, emphasised even more by the cool blue of the sky, it's got more of a Northern European feel to it. And if you were wanting to kind of create a more kind of warm Mediterranean, Southern European feel, then these colours do that. Now, one of the effects of deepening, doing the colour shift and deepening the colour a bit, the tones, is it has emphasised these splats on the wall. Now again, there's a personal thing. I can only assume that he wanted to have those in because it adds a bit of texture to the photo. For my money though, it's distracting, because actually I think when you look at this photo, the first thing you see is not the woman reading, the first thing you see is the splats on the wall. Then you notice the woman reading. But the story is about the woman reading. The story is not about the splats. So I would say this is one of those examples, and I talk from having done this 1,000 times myself. You make the crop, you see the woman in the window, you go, woohoo, it's so obvious that the woman in the window is where your story is, that you mentally filter out the dominance of another aspect of the photo. And in this case, the dominance of those splats on the wall is actually really dominant, more dominant than I would suspect Paul actually realised. Now, I could be doing Paul an injustice if I am. I apologise for that. I'm just sort of saying it as the way that I would see it, and I can imagine making that kind of mistake. So basically with this, essentially the critique is you want to watch out for the splats, give it a little bit more room to breathe, and I think that would automatically improve what you're doing. So I hope that was useful. Okay, what else do I want to do here? Keith, right, yes. So if I now put it back into here, Keith asked quite an interesting question here now. Keith Walker, as a wee project, I'm beginning to take pictures in and around old decaying local farm buildings. Inside conditions are often both dark and yet very contrasty with shafts of very bright light. I'm currently trying to get around this by taking a range of exposures with the camera mounted on a tripod and combining them as a single HDR image, example shown, and that's the one that we've got here. I'm not always happy with the rather artificial effect HDR produces, nor having to cart a tripod around all the time. I wondered therefore if you've had to use a flash in similar light situations, and if so, what you found works in terms of the number of lights, what to expose for, etc. So yeah, there's getting into old buildings, obviously you've got to be careful nothing's going to fall on you, you need safety, you need to make sure you've got permission, all that. But those things aside, once you've got those things, getting into old buildings can be amazing. There's a fantastic photographer, Sven, sorry, I can't remember his last name, I will dig it out at some point. But Sven is an absolute master of finding these incredible old buildings and which are all falling apart, and taking the most amazing photos of them. And in fact, he has a beautiful book called The Beauty of Decay. You might even have other ones. So yeah, you getting drawn into that. It's a really exciting kind of photography project you can do. But as Keith says, the problem is that very often these places are quite dark, but what's making them interesting is shafts of light coming through, particular textures that are being pulled out. Excuse me. So how do you deal with these things? Now, that notion of doing multiple exposures, so you expose for the highlights, you expose for the shadows, and then in your editing program you can combine these things, is definitely one way of doing it. So it's a way a lot of people do it, but as Keith also says, that it doesn't always sit comfortable. It doesn't necessarily give him the effect that he wanted. What he would rather do is be able to sort of take it there and then, or get a better version of it. And that's where what you do is you do a mix of flash and natural light. So a lot of people tend to think you're either shooting in natural light or you're shooting in artificial light. But I mean, if we go back to that picture I did of Andrew here, I'm shooting in natural light, as in this side of him is completely lit by the sun, but I've also got a flash on the other side of him to fill in some of these shadows so that he's not too contrasty. But in order to do that, what you have to do is you have to set your camera to expose for the natural light first. So find your highlights, find your brightest areas in the picture, and adjust your exposure settings for them. If you've got light meters, use a light meter. Otherwise, you can just be looking in the back of the camera and seeing if your highlights are blown out or if they're looking okay. Make your adjustments. Then, once you've adjusted for the light, now take your flashes and place them in wherever you think they need to be placed, whether it's one or multiple, to shine a light into where the shadows are. And then adjust them, increasing or decreasing the power level, depending on how much you want them lit up and how much shadow you want remaining. And then whether it's one flash or it's multiple flashes, this comes down to your patience, your skill, how much you want to play. As I think I said last week, play. I mean, playing is fun. Playing is how we learn. Get out there, have fun. So basically the key to this then, Keith, is expose for the brightest part of the picture and then use the flashes to fill in the shadows to the degree that you want to. And the great thing about digital is we can take hundreds of photos until we get it right. Go click, set the flash, look in the back. If it's too bright, adjust the flash. If it's too dark, adjust the flash, adjust your settings, keep playing until such time as you get the settings you want for those particular circumstances. I hope that helps. Okay, next picture, what have we got? We've got Stuart Mitchell posted this one. We picture while he was out, taken on his phone. I asked further in the comments if there was anything particular he was wanting to know. He said, I'm quite happy with it in terms of a snap of the moment, but perhaps tips on getting more for feel or atmosphere into such pictures would be good and less clinical, perhaps. Now, there's a sort of certain trickiness here in terms of what you do differently, because, as he says, it's a snap while he's out. You're out on the bike, you see the church, you park the bike, you've got the gates. He's seen a scene and he's put it together. You're using the phone. The phone has a wide angle, natural tended wide angle on it, so it can fit as the maximum that it can into the space. That has a tendency to distort at the edges. And what we actually notice is up around the church here, the church looks like it's leaning over a little bit. So I would automatically have a think about, in editing, you would sort of look to straighten that up a little bit. That's on a technical level. If you were playing with that rule of thirds idea, what we do here, if we sort of look at the way this is divided up, then this line is kind of cutting through the middle of the church. There's a great big space down the bottom here, which maybe isn't adding too much to it. So if you sort of brought that up a little bit, got the bike in there, and then maybe brought that down a bit, you're kind of, I would say that feels like it's a sort of slightly more interesting crop. But really, what Stuart's asking for here is how to add more feel and atmosphere. And the reality is, to get more atmosphere into it, you need different light. This kind of photo is great as a snap, and it's understanding the limitation of what you're doing while you're doing it. We whip out our little phone cameras, we take a scene, and it's great. It's a reminder of where we were. It's a gateway to the memories. Maybe it's quite a nice little photo, and you can sort of stick it up, and there's nothing wrong with the photo in terms of if that's what you're trying to do. If, however, you were trying to sort of do a competition winning entry, then you would have to go back at a different time. The lighting in this is incredibly flat. There's no shadows, so there's very little depth to it. If this was taken in the evening or sort of or early morning, and you had shafts of light coming, perhaps the church was in a darker in the shadow side, there was shadows streaming along with highlights of grass, bits in the trees catching the light, and then you're going to have atmosphere. If there was dramatic clouds, if you just post sunset where you've got glorious colours skimming across the clouds behind the church, and the church a little bit more silhouetted, that would create atmosphere. So by and large, the way you're mostly going to create the atmosphere is through the lighting. In this photo, you can only deal with the lighting that you've got, but if you really wanted to do that, then what I would suggest is you go back out to this site at different times of the day, even different times of the year, are going to give you different kinds of feel to it. I'm not a landscape photographer, however, I do know a couple of damn good landscape photographers. And one of the things I know is that they will hunt down their photo. They will go back to a place time and time and time again, constantly seeking the right kind of lighting conditions to get the photo they want. It's very rare for any photographer to just turn up, take the photo, have the perfect conditions, take the photo and leave. Might happen every now and again, but you can't make a living doing that. You have to hunt the photo. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight. Now, the next photo isn't a photo, it's a painting. But this is less of a critique. This is actually a question, and this was coming from Samantha. Now, Samantha said, my next question would be, what would be a good starter camera for high-resolution photographs of work for my prints, or am I better having my paintings scanned at the printers? So what we're touching on here is the notion of product photography. Now, I might talk a bit more in length in future about that, especially if I get a few people asking me about it. It's a tricky one. You can have, if you've got a painting, you've got your painting looks great. You take a photo of it, the photo is never going to be as good as the original. It just isn't, even the best cameras aren't as sophisticated as the human eye, and then it kind of depends on the painting as well. Is the painting very smooth? Is the painting textured? And if it's textured, how are you able to capture some of that texture? So it's not just a case of pointing the camera at it. How it is lit makes a big difference. There's also, how big is this going to be printed? If you find you can take this photo, you put it up on the web, it's good enough perhaps at this resolution. But if you're wanting to make prints of it, you now have to think much more about the quality of it once it's printed. What's good enough for the web is not good enough for print automatically. There's a whole thing about resolution, which again I can talk about another time if people really want me to. So you do need a good camera because you need a high resolution image with lots of megapixels, but you also need good lighting for it. It needs to be well lit, as bright as you can make it, without changing the colours of it and without blowing it out or making it too pale. Now, my wife is an artist, and over the years I've had to take many photos of her work, and I can do an adequate job, but I'm not a product photographer, and there are people who can do this much better than me. Ewan Adamson, if you want to stay in Dumfries and Galloway, is excellent at this kind of thing. And in fact, he's the guy I use. A couple of years ago, my wife had a big exhibition at Gracefield Arts Centre in Dumfries. And we needed some real top-notch quality photos to be making prints, for doing publicity, to send to the magazines and newspapers. And I was fine doing the photos, the portrait photos, the photos with my wife at work in them. But the actual pictures of the paintings, which were very textured, very nuanced, lots of subtlety, my skills weren't up to it. And so I asked Ewan, who I know does this, and he came in and I sat there and watched him. And even though I watched him, and even though he told me absolutely everything he was doing as he was doing it, I still kind of sat there in awe at what he was able to achieve. Because he does this all the time, he's got an eye for it, he can solve the problems quickly. So I would say if you're going to kind of create, if you really want a picture which you want to make sure you're going to get the best quality print for, it's not just a case of scanning it, it's not just a case of of putting out your own camera and photographing it. You really ideally get somebody in who knows what they're doing. Like I say, it all depends on the level at which, if you're just doing a couple of prints for friends, that doesn't matter. But if you were planning on doing a limited edition print run or something similar, or this was going to be going down to some real, top-notch gallery, if you're trying to send your images out to top-notch galleries and really impress them, and you really need your photos, your paintings to be truly represented in the prints and the photos, get somebody in to do it. And as I say, Ewan Adamson would be my go-to guy in Dumfries and Galloway. There are other people about, look about, ask around. Make sure you get people who can recommend highly. Right, what else do I want here? Yeah, Joe Smith, I'll just say actually, she posted in the group about photographing the moon. So I have this group, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, same name as the episodes podcast. Just type that into Facebook and you'll find the group. You can join the group. So the group is there for people to leave their questions, leave their photos, in order for me to then talk about them during these episodes. However, if you want, when you post an image, you can say, start it off with Kim, and then that's leaving it for me, or put in for the group, group critique, which means you're then asking whether anybody else in the group has got ideas. And already, even though this has only been going a little over a week, it's been really interesting. A kind of community is starting to build where there are some people who are coming in and actually being able to give really good advice to other people who are submitting. And for these photos, Jo had taken a photo of the moon, but she didn't know how to get it exposed. It was just this sort of blown out white ball in the sky. And immediately somebody came in and said, can you adjust your exposure? Somebody else came in and a whole thread within it sort of built up. And Jo immediately came back and then started posting other photos that she'd taking the advice, and got to a point whereby she'd actually achieved what she wanted to do, learned a ton in the process. So there's no need for me to go over this. If you want to, go to the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook page, scroll down, you'll find it, unless you happen to be watching this many weeks or months later. So it's a good example. If you want to go beyond what I'm doing here and you want to tap into another group of people who are happy to help, then join the group. Okay, I will now go on to Kaylee. Let's just open this one. And so Kaylee took this with a macro lens. The subject is mushroom coral under an LED blue light. I asked her what she was particularly looking for. Excuse me. She says, looking for composition, colour, blur ratio, etc. It was taken through the glass in my tank, so that had its challenges, hopefully still a clear image. So what we've got here is pretty much an abstract blue image. I wouldn't have known mushroom coral. That's my ignorance. Doesn't matter. It's texture, it's colour, its shape. So we're into abstract. It's not a directly representational picture. So abstract, we're then sort of moving into another realm of photography, and it in some ways becomes even more a matter of taste. One person can love it, somebody else can go, does absolutely nothing for me. So part of the thing with this, though, is I would say it really comes down to, what are you chasing, Kaylee? What is it you're after? And how well does this match up to it? Abstract work, I can look for things, but I'm going to be looking for something different to what you're looking for. I happen to know this because my wife, who I said earlier, is an artist. She creates abstract art. And it's not random. She is chasing very specific lines and shapes and forms and textures and colour combinations. And even though it's not representational of anything, it is... She's not satisfied. She talk about sort of almost an itch in the bones. She's not satisfied until it comes together in the way that she's happy with it. Sometimes she'll ask me how it's going. She hasn't finished it yet, and she'll ask what I think, and that's an extraordinarily difficult one to answer, because I don't know where she's trying to take it. So there is this thing with it. Now, I'm not sure where you're trying to take it, Kaylee. I think, there's an immediate interest. There's a what's going on. There's, again, much like a lot of these, where do you decide to crop it? Where's the story? There's a slide curve running around it. Most of the power is shooting up the way, but the blur is going across. So it's a narrow depth of focus, and what this means is only a little bit of this is sharp. As it gets further away, it blurs out. As it comes more towards you, it blurs out. So where you decide to do that, how much blur you want in the foreground or the background, there's a certain amount of taste with that. I quite like the idea that you've not got it purely sharp in the background and the whole thing blurs out behind it, but you've got a bit of blur in the foreground, because it does mean that you're then feeling like you're into the photo rather than just it's all at the front with blur behind. Interesting shapes, but I suppose really, like I say, I'm not sure what it is you're going for. If you're happy with the blue, you go with the blue. You could just as easily colour shift it. Somebody else would be just as happy seeing this in pink or yellow or green or red. In fact, actually, again, if I just lean past the camera and if I just go hue saturation for a moment. I just want to show very briefly, if I colour shift here, purples and reds, quite different. Oranges and yellows, reds and yellows, greens and oranges, greens and yellows. Now, when you take something like that, you've now not just got shape contrast, you've got colour contrast as well. I'm not saying you have to do this, I'm just pointing that out. Different shades of green, blues and green, and then slowly we come back to where we started. So, in terms of your editing, you can play around with the colours, but really the most important thing is you can take a photo and you go, that's interesting, what can I do with it? Or you can have something that an idea that you're chasing, and you're not going to feel satisfied until you've got it, in which case keep chasing, take from different angles, try different colours, keep going until you get to a point whereby essentially you've managed to scratch the bones, you managed to go, okay, now I'm happy with that. So hopefully that gives you something. Okay, and the last photo I want to deal with this evening is from Martin Johnson. Although I did say, if you want to post the images, it is helpful to me if you get them to me before lunchtime on Tuesday, because obviously Tuesday afternoon I'm trying to put everything together. Martin managed to slip this one in just while I was having a breather, so I thought, well, okay, I will include it this week. So what we've got, squirrel, and I asked Martin what he was asked about. Basically, he was just asking for a general critique. So, I'll start off with saying, had I taken this photo, I would be delighted. I would be over the moon to have a photo like this, because I'm not a wildlife photographer. My wildlife photography is appalling. Most of my photos of wildlife are of the back of a squirrel as it disappears into the trees. I might have caught a little tuft of tail sticking out from behind a branch, or a bird as it's flying away, I always seem to sort of, by the time I see the creature and I've pulled up my camera and I've followed it and gone click, it's gone. I have about 2 or 3 photos of wild animals. I think I've got one of a deer. I do have one of a squirrel in a tree, which were just the sort of absolute total and utter luck of the moment. I have a huge respect for wildlife photographers, because it's something I can't do. Part of that is I don't have the patience for it. I mean, again, all the best wildlife photographers really will sit for hours on end in a hide somewhere, waiting for the right combination of animal, lighting, background to get what they want. Now, some of them have various tricks, like, we can see here there's what looks like probably a bunch of peanuts sitting in the foreground. So I'm guessing Martin is sitting a little way back. He's got will have a zoom lens on. He's put some nuts there where he knows the squirrels tend to hang out, and the squirrels come down to get it. So that squirrel photo, starting off by saying it's far better than anything I could do. However, Would it win grand awards? No. The real problem here is much like that picture by Stuart earlier, which is the light is dull. If you look at the real award-winning photos, if you look at it's not just enough to get the squirrel, you have to get it lit in such a way that it really grabs you. So if you've got a bit of light, which is then picking out the detail of the fur, if they've got little dappled light in the background or something like that, or there's all sorts of things that you can do with the lighting. Crop wise, I would say I think there's probably a bit too much. There's either too much space or not enough space. I think you either need to give it more space so you can get a sense of the environment it's in, or the fact that it's blurred out makes me think that you were deliberately trying to pull in which case, actually, if you just crop this in a little closer, just if we do that rule of thirds thing, if you just take that line down to the eyes of the squirrel, then I think you suddenly find that that sits slightly more comfortable. And in fact, what I might also do for something like this is add a vignette. Now, quickest way for me to do that is I'll just quickly do this in Camera Raw. I thought I would do it in Camera Raw. Right, okay, here we go. So for something like this, if I brightened it up a little bit, if I maybe gave a little bit more contrast, but at the same time, having done that, I've now dulled the colours a little bit, maybe so richen the colours a little bit, maybe it might be too much, but we'll play with that. I could even give it I could either make it cooler, or I could make it warmer. Maybe slightly warmer, brings out the oranges and reds in the fur. But then I've got this little bit with vignette, and the vignette, if you look in the corners of the photo, right. So now, if we compare that to that, we've got a brighter, slightly warmer colour shift. We've cropped in, and I put this vignette around the edges. Now it's overdone for what it needs to be, but I'm just using that to get across the idea that by darkening down the corners, it draws your attention much more to the front. Whereas if we go back to the original, there's a lot of space up here which is taking away, isn't contributing anything to the story. We come in here, the story is now much more central. So in the editing process, you can make things to boost it, but ultimately the real thing for this is and it goes to kind of the heart of photography. There's the content, and then there's the way the content is displayed or captured, and the way the lighting is sitting in it, and the way the composition sits together. And in this case, you got the squirrel, amazing. And like I say, had I got the squirrel, I'd have been delighted. But in terms of trying to create a better photo, you've really got to get the lighting as well. Right, is that... I think that pretty much covers the questions. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip just into Facebook, which is going to frighten the life out of me, because I've deliberately not been keeping this Facebook live feed on my screen, because there's something like about a 10-second delay behind the picture on the screen and the way that I'm talking. So there's this awful disconnect. I move my head and then my picture doesn't move its head, and then I start wondering what's going on, and I get so caught up in that, you watching just wonder what on earth I'm doing. But I will just see if there happen to be any questions or anything that's come in. Okay, lots of hellos and nice things. That's good. That's great. Okay. Cool. Okay, so mostly it's it's lovely comments supporting comments. Really appreciated. It's nice to know there are some there are some people actually out there watching it. Right, I can now see my face not lining up with the way that I'm actually talking, so I'm going to skip back to a picture which isn't interrupting me quite so much. So that pretty much brings me to the end of this one. I've been going for about an hour now. So what I'd like to do is thank you all very much for watching. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please consider donating to paypal.me/Ayres. It's not compulsory, but it is always appreciated. If you haven't already, then do please join the Facebook group, Understanding Photography with Ayres, where you can post questions you would like me to answer or submit your photos for critique and deeper understanding ready for next week. Go dig through, find a picture, think, I was never quite happy with this, would like a bit of feedback on it, and let me know. You can also, I've now finally got my YouTube channel together. If you want to go to YouTube, hit subscribe, that would be fantastic. What I'm going to be doing now is, whilst this has gone out live, here we are on Tuesday the 14th of April, probably tomorrow I am recording this at the same time, so I will upload it to YouTube, and so you can go back and catch up on any of the bits and pieces. So if you are watching this on YouTube as well, all you need to do is, in fact, let me just flick back to here. So somewhere down there, you'll find the subscribe button on YouTube. If you can hit subscribe, then that will keep you notified of new ones as they come up. It also allows you to come back. Hopefully this is going to be a big long series, and you can come back and go through the archives at a later date and go, what was that thinking? Was talking about rule of thirds, or what was he talking about with cropping, or anything like that. So that's pretty much it. Hope to see you next Tuesday, 7:30 on Facebook Live. Have a good week. Thank you. And now bear with me while I find end live video.